Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you'd like to jump from one section of the video to the other, you can mouse over the timeline here and find the title to each chapter and jump to that one as you prefer. So I have a couple of tidbits to talk to you about. I have one finished object to show you. I have some really old finished objects that I thought you might be interested in seeing some of the pieces that I knit early on in my knitting career. And then I am going to answer some questions that have come up on my Ravelry group or in the comments of my videos in the past few months. So let's get started. So the first little tidbit that I have for you is that the live stream on short rows that I originally had scheduled for May 31st that I had to cancel, it's been rescheduled for this weekend, June 21st at 2 o'clock Central Daylight Time. That's noon on the west coast of the United States. That's 3 p.m. on the East Coast. And if you live in the UK, that's going to be, I think, about 8 o'clock at night. And in Western Europe, at least, it'll be 9 o'clock, I believe, for the live stream. So I'll be giving some, it'll be a little different than previous live streams, which have just been an Ask Me Anything type of Q&A live stream, just to kind of see how things were going to work. This time I'm going to try something a little different, which is to teach a bit of a topic, short rows, give some explanatory material about short rows and the various techniques that are used for them, what they're for, how they work, that sort of thing. And then we'll open it up for questions. So I'll try to answer as many questions as is possible or feasible or that I can manage off the top of my head during that live stream. So that'll be this Sunday, and it will be recorded. So if you miss the live stream, you'll always be able to go back and watch it again later after the fact. I mentioned, I think it was last week, about some of these Zoom presentations, these webinars that I've been able to participate in that have been either in other states or even in some cases in other countries that have had to be done that way because live events have been canceled. And what I was mentioning was that that's really an interesting idea, and my hope is that in the future, when there are live events, that there will also be an option for the Zoom type of participation by people around the world. And so our local Knitters Guild, we had to cancel our March meeting because that was, when they were starting to cancel large gatherings. And then our April meeting is normally when our guild has its annual Yarn Over conference, where they bring in teachers from all over the country, and we rearrange our guild meeting for that weekend so that one of the speakers can stay an extra day, and people who have come in from out of town for their once a year chance to go to a guild event get to actually go to a guild meeting. So we had 2 months where we didn't have any kind of meetings at all. And then last month we started doing our guild meetings via Zoom, and it was really successful. And we had so many people who live in what we call the outstate area. That just means the part of our state that's outside of the metropolitan area. So people who wouldn't normally be able to come to guild meetings were able to come to that, and even people from out of state. And we had just a huge number of people show up. Well, we had our this month's guild meeting on Tuesday, and they were it was mostly a business, sort of the annual meeting where they're presenting the slate of board members for election and telling about their plans for the next year. And one of the things that they're talking about is continuing to do the guild meetings via Zoom for at least some of the months, particularly in the winter when the weather can really cause problems for people trying to get to where the guild meetings are. And also because the textile center where the guild meets is in the city of Minneapolis, sometimes we have parking restrictions if we've had a lot of snow, so you can only park on one side of the street. And then the parking lots, even though they've been plowed, a lot of the snow is piled up and you have fewer parking spaces. So a lot of times parking is a real issue. So one of the things they're thinking about is having some of our guild meetings in the winter by Zoom, and that would allow us to have speakers from other places that we normally wouldn't be able to bring in for a meeting. So it's really changing some of the ways that our guild is thinking about how to provide our monthly programs to the membership. And I really think that, if anything good comes out of 2020, it's that people around the world are being forced to change their way of thinking about so many things. They're really being forced to address things that they didn't want to address or were ignoring or whatever, and in all manner of ways, and really putting the work in to figure out how can we make something happen that we just didn't bother to do before. We said was going to be too hard to do, and we can see that, okay, this is not only satisfactory in some ways, it's better to be able to allow more and more people to participate in these presentations. So that's something I'm really looking forward to. So I have one project that I have knit in the past couple of weeks, and that is yet another pair of socks. It's summertime. I tend to knit a lot of socks. I really am about to get back to my 1920s sweater, in part because it's getting toward the end of June, and there was this 1920s Roaring Twenties knit along that I was participating with in the All Things Vintage group on Ravelry, and so it ends at the end of June, and so I really like to get it done by then. But in the meantime, I knit another pair of socks. So this is a pair of socks. This is one of the socks that I knit, and I was using to demonstrate this heel, the plain heel as it's called, or Instathought heel. So I could knit it cuff down, and when I got to the bottom of the leg, I could just knit this peasant style heel that normally you would have to wait until the end and go back, so you can knit it right away and then continue on. And so I've been using it to demonstrate how to do central double decreases, so you get this single line of decreases along the edge rather than having two side-by-side decreases, either that are right next to each other or separated by a couple of them like they often are. So this yarn, this is one of those Regia Perfect yarns. I think this one is one of the Arnie and Carlos. They do a lot of the color designs currently. They haven't always. I've knit several pairs of Perfect. The original ones were not design line. They didn't have any specific designer. And I think there was a pair that I knit at one point that might have been Kay Facet color designs. I really like the ones when they get Kay Facet to do design line self-patterning sock yarn. I really love those. You know, my leg isn't super big around, and so the way this Perfect yarn works is it starts out, the ball starts out with the contrast color, and you just keep knitting your ribbing until the contrast color runs out, and when it switches to the pattern color, then you switch to stockinette, and when it switches back to the contrast color, that's when you knit your heel. And if you're doing a short row heel, then when you're done, you just keep going, and at some point it'll switch back to self-patterning. I have to modify my peasant heels. If I'd done a short row heel, I would have had to have modified that as well. And they just don't have enough yarn for the heel in order for there to be enough to do the complete heel. So I had to steal some from the end of the first half of the ball and then join it to the heel in order to have enough enough of the dark blue to knit in this color. But because my sock isn't that big around, there's plenty of leftover the solid color blue. In fact, there's enough of this solid color blue that I think that I can use it to knit just contrast heels in a pair of socks knit with a different self-striping blue yarn that's very, very similar in color, but not one of these perfect colorways. So the leg I thought was a little bit long for me, and that's the trouble with perfect, is that the fewer stitches you have in the round, the longer the leg is going to be. And so this is really the longest leg. It's almost a little bit too snug because it's coming up to right where my calf muscle gets bigger, and normally I would stop it, and it's going up a little bit further than that. So knowing what I know now, I probably would have knit the cuff about an inch shorter, but I didn't know that. So I have a couple of long socks. So I did a round toe for this. I have a video on how to do that. I actually have videos, I have videos for this, and I also have a video for the round toe. And it's a toe I'm really liking. I tried it out, I think last summer, when I was making some videos for to go along with the August Sock knit along tutorial that I have that teaches you how to knit a custom fit sock based on your measurements and based on where you're likely to have fit issues and all that. So I tried this round heel, and at first I was a little, I don't know if I like it. I actually like it a lot, and my daughter in the Netherlands prefers it. I tried it for her, and I said, what do you think of it? She goes, oh, I like this better. So that's the kind of toe I'm knitting for her. I think I'm going to keep these for myself. My kids and my mother and I all have the same foot size and fit issues. So if I knit a pair of socks that fit me, they're going to fit any of them. So I'm thinking about sending these to my mother. When I went to visit her last November, she had gotten dressed and she came out and she was kind of complaining about her socks were too tight and they didn't fit right. And they were, those socks were knit using a yarn that I really like. It's got some mohair in it, and it's super warm for winter time. It's my favorite yarn for that. And the wool is superwash, but I think it's the kind of superwash it must be where, or it's not technically superwash, but it's machine washable wool where the scales are glued down rather than removed. Because after these socks get washed some number of times, then they start to felt, and that's what hers had done. So I wanted to replace them, and another reason is I really like these. They're pretty color. I guess there is a little bit of almost blue purple in here, but for some reason when I knit socks with self-striping sock yarn, the ones I keep for myself almost always have red, pink, or purple in them. And any socks that don't have those colors, I somehow feel like, well, those aren't my socks. Who am I going to give these to? So I might send these to my mother, because it seems like maybe she needs some new pairs of socks to replace some of those that have shrunk. So a couple of weeks ago, I explained how I do knitting experiments, like how I approach learning something new in knitting, and how I look for different written references, and then how I look for online written references, and then finally I look for video references, and I kind of compare the different methods, see how they're the same, how they're different. And so my goal was then I was going to do this experiment and then show you how it worked out. And the past few weeks have been just an upheaval here, so I completely forgot about it until I was preparing for today's video, looking to see what I was going to talk about. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I never did get back to that Russian graft experiment. So I will do that this coming week. I had an article that was due this week that I was kind of absorbing all of my attention, and I just didn't even think about it. So that will be coming up in the next week or two, depending on how things go. So last weekend, I was a guest on Suzanne Bryan's live stream. It was on Saturday, and it was a lot of fun. She has a couple of different YouTube channels. One of them, she does her technique videos, and then she's got a separate channel where she does Off the Cuff, which are live stream videos. Sometimes they're interviews or guest appearances, and sometimes she's teaching a topic. So I was a guest on that last weekend, and it was a lot of fun. Before we did the live stream, like a couple days before, we were chatting by Skype and talking about how the live stream was going to go and things we might be talking about. And one of the things she mentioned was for me to have ready some of my early knitting, because sometimes people are interested in that. And I was trying to think, what I even had in my house that would be the earliest knitting. So I had gone around the house and I had this pile of things in my office, and then we never got to that topic. So what I thought might be fun is for me to talk about some of my early knitting, show you some of it, and then talk a little bit about things where it might not be visible to a casual observer, but things that a knitter looking at up close would see, oh, this could be a problem, or this could be improved anyway. I learned to knit in the beginning of 1986, and I don't think that there's anything in the house that I have knit prior to 1988 or 89. And the reason is well, a lot of what I knit and continue to knit is gifts. So I'll knit something and it leaves and I never see it again. So I was knitting a lot of things for my family. I knit sweaters for every member of my family, and I had a brand new nephew, and then I had a niece that arrived. And so I loved doing that. I was working with and had friends who were having babies, and so I was knitting things for gifts, for baby gifts and things like that. So a lot of what I knit was given away. The first thing that I knit for myself was my very first project, which I knit in Ireland, and it was I was knitting it in like January and February, and it was a summer top, a sleeveless V-neck cotton top. So it was kind of a nubbly cotton, and the nubbly bits were kind of shiny. And I had decided I wanted to jazz it up a little bit and knit the ribbing in a red pearl cotton. And so I knit it and it was done. Of course, I knew nothing about washing and blocking at the time, so I didn't wash it at all. And it was still winter, and I came back to the United States in the spring, and then pretty soon it warmed up enough and I could finally wear it. So I wore it a number of times. If it's summertime, so after a few wearings, it got a little smelly. So I thought, okay, it's time to wash it. And so it's very, very careful to follow the directions. I think I must have saved the yarn label. I knew that I was supposed to hand wash it in cold water, and so I filled up the bathroom sink and put some kind of mild soap in it or something, and I put it in there, and that red ribbing just bled like crazy, and it stained the white cotton sweater, and so it made it pink, and I couldn't get it out, and it was very upsetting. And the thing is, I was only back in the United States for a year, and then I left again to go to New Zealand. So in the year that I was back here in the United States, I knit myself a sweater. Is the sweater, this book right here, this knit kit, is the book that I bought in Ireland. When I bought all of my knitting materials, my flatmates helped me learn the knit stitch, and then I had to learn the purl stitch on my own. They'd all left for the weekend. So I went to a bookstore and I found a book, and it was this book. It has a reference section in the front, and then it had this package of cards, and there are these patterns, and it was all sealed up. Couldn't look at it, but I could see like the little thumbnails of all of them. But that was the book that I decided I was going to buy the next week. So let's see. So this is all beat up. So this is the sweater that I knit myself when I got back to the United States. And I liked the colors, so I bought yarn that was the same color. I didn't know it at the time, but this type of color work was mosaic color work. So it's a slip stitch color work pattern. You're working 2 rows in one color, and then you work the next color, and some of the stitches you slip, and that's how you get the color pattern. So I knit this sweater for myself, and I had a friend who was still living in the college town. His name's Steve. He was in law school by then. and he was a little guy, and he really liked that sweater. So when I was leaving to go to New Zealand, you know, I had a limit to what I could take with me. And just like before I went to London to work, I sold off a lot of things I owned, like my typewriter, and you know, I'd sold my album collection, and I stored some things that I really wanted to keep forever at my mom's house. But I gave that sweater to my friend Steve, and I said, you know, and I liked the sweater. I'd done a nice job with it, except for the cast on edge, because I was such a tight cast, so tight at long tail cast on. It was always really rigid, and then the ribbing would stretch, but the edge wouldn't. And I'm like, are you sure you want it? Because the edge doesn't stretch very much. He's like, no, I want it. So that was perfectly fine sweater, and I gave it to him. And while I was living in Ann Arbor that year between living overseas twice, I was living with 3 girls who were, well, 2 of them were in art school and 1 was in architecture. And I was showing them these books that I had, these Kay Facet books, like Glorious Knits, things like that. And he always worked with color, and he would have a palette of yarns and different colors and shades, and he'd blend them together. And first of all, as a college student, I couldn't afford to just have a room full of yarn. But secondly, I was slightly colorblind, really intimidated, didn't know anything about mixing colors like that. So one of my roommates, Jackie, came to a yarn shop with me, and she was showing me how you could, you know, hold 2 yarn, like take a strand of yarn from one ball and lay it across the other, so you could see how the 2 colors were going to interact with each other, because when you look at them separately, you can't always tell. And so but I was still like afraid to do that. So for my birthday, my 3 roommates pooled some money together, and they bought me different shades of blue yarns and I think some black, in order for me to make a vest using one of the Kay Facet patterns. And I know that vest is somewhere in this house, but I don't know where it is. I think it might be down in the basement, which is probably not the best place to store it. So if I ever find it, I would love to see it myself. But that would probably be the thing that I knit earliest that I would still own myself. So I do have two things that I knit probably in 1989, maybe 1990. One of them was a little sweater. My niece was born 3 days after I returned from New Zealand. I was living with my brother here in the Twin Cities. I was living in his basement. My niece was born 3 days later. And then they all moved back to Michigan the following year. For my niece, I think for when she was going to turn 2, I made her this little cardigan sweater, and it's stranded colorwork. It was with superwash wool, but it is slightly felted. Probably went through the dryer with other clothes. But when I had my first daughter, my sister-in-law packed up this sweater and sent it back to me. She kept the little sweaters I'd knit for my nephew, but she sent this back to me. So this was, the knitting is actually pretty good. I had to knit it flat and do stranded, which is not that easy. And everything's kind of felted a little bit on the inside. What was interesting to me when I was looking at it the other day was to see the buttonhole. I don't know if you can see. Do you see that there's actually 2 holes there? I'm not sure why that is. It's certainly, it was a mistake. I mean, I can see that I did for some reason, I just made the buttonhole twice. I don't know why, but so that's a little bit of a mistake. So this doesn't really have side seams because the body was all knit in one piece, but things are seamed, the shoulder seams and the sleeves are seamed, but I can't really examine the seams at all because of the felting. But this is probably the oldest sweater I have that I knit for myself. This was a sweater where I saw the picture, and once again, I liked the sweater in the picture. I didn't want to make it different colors. I wanted those colors, and it was a pattern from a yarn company, so the yarn shop sold that yarn. And here, this is the sweater right here. And I have never worn it very much. There were a couple of things I didn't like about it. I didn't like my tension. One of the things that I was always good at with knitting was like my actual stitches were very even and I always got gauge. My seams weren't very good. And a lot of the techniques like for picking up stitches for necklines, I didn't really understand how to do that. And obviously my buttonholes weren't always so great, but my stitches were even. And I think that was one of the things I didn't like about it. And the thing is, I don't know that it would be much better now than this is on the sweater. The problem with this, the challenge with this sweater, is that there is stranded color work, but it's intarsia stranded color work because there are just areas of stranded work and it doesn't span all the way across. So you have little blocks of area where you're working, where you're alternating between two colors, and then you have just a single color going across a big span. And so with intarsia, the fabric is the same. It's color block knitting. You work with one color and then you switch to the other color, and you're only working in that color. And then the next, if you have another section that was in the same color that you originally used, you'd use a different ball. So the fabric is basically like any regular stockinette fabric. It's just that when you switch from one color to another, you're linking the two colors together to avoid a hole between those two stitches. With stranded color work, you're alternating between two colors all the way across the row or through the round. And so you're creating a double layer of fabric. And because those two strands are kind of running together across the back of the fabric, it changes the shape of the stitches. So the gauge that you get with stranded color work typically is not the same you'd get with solid stockinette, and it's not because you're working the stitches too tight or you're not giving enough slack between the stitches. I mean, that could be a problem, but usually the problem is just that the proportion, the way that the stitches proportion changes. Rather than being a rectangle, it turns into something that's more like a square. So, and then it ends up double thick. So I think that is really what was going on with this fabric. Is just that the distortion and the change from switching from solid to stranded in different sections is what made me not like my results as much. The seaming, I didn't know how to seam using mattress stitch. I knew how to do back stitch, and so that's what I did. One of the things I'm noticing in the vintage pattern books that I've been acquiring, like the first half of the 20th century, when you get a good clear photograph, you can tell that the seams are basically look like what my old seams look like. They're not that tidy. It really took until about the 1960s when people started using mattress stitch, which creates a much smoother, prettier looking seam from the right side of the work. And I think my understanding is that came from machine knitting, that people were buying these Japanese knitting machines. Now, people had been buying Japanese knitting machines in the early part of the century too, but they really somehow took off in the 50s and 60s. And I know that when I bought a knitting machine when my oldest daughter was a year old, machine knitting is so different from hand knitting. Like I was not using, yarns that were in a pattern. I was having to do gauge swatches because when you are machine knitting fabric, the fabric is, coming down and you have weights hanging off of it. So it distorts the fabric. So you can't just take a ruler and say, oh, I'm getting 5 stitches per inch. You don't know what you're getting until you've taken off the machine, let it rest, wash it and dry, or do whatever it is you need to do it, let it rest for a day or two, and then you can take your gauge. So you can't really wing things if you want something that fits to a certain specification. So I really learned a lot from machine knitting about a gauge swatching, but I also learned other techniques, like I grafted the shoulders of a sweater. When I made a sweater for my youngest daughter right here. This is actually just a plain black sweater. The ribbing is 2-color. But, and then I embroidered those little flowers on there, but I grafted the shoulders together. And I remember when I learned to knit socks on how to do grafting, it was not the same as how I did this, because with this I could have the two pieces of fabric flat and I could follow the path of the stitches. With a sock, you've got a tube and it's hanging down. You can't lay the two sets of live stitches like this. So it was a very different process. But so this is the, machine knitting taught me to do grafting, but I can look at the seams on this sweater and I could see I was still using back stitch to do the side seams. Then another sweater, this one has been lent out to so many different people. So here is another little sweater I did machine knitting with little daisies on it, and I put little daisy buttons. So this one I was trying to figure out some kind of machine knitting joining method here for the shoulders. It's very rigid and there's no stretch in it at all. But if I look at the side seams here, and I look at the inside, I was using mattress stitch. So this is probably and it's not a particularly good job of mattress stitch, or maybe it's just me pulling the fabric apart. But so, I can tell that was what I was learning on this little sweater right here. So that's just a tour through a few of my earliest knits that I have in the house. And some of these are very treasured items. The little sweaters I made for my niece and my daughters, I will keep always. And that purple and green sweater, I don't know why I hang on to it. But I do. I just can't let it go. And I think maybe it's because it is the oldest thing that I've knit, and I kind of just want to hang on to that. Okay, so I'm going to answer a couple of questions. I've got a list of them right here, a little of things to talk about that have come up in either my group or in the comments of my videos in the past couple months, and I'll just answer a few of them until I think I've gone on long enough. There was a question a few weeks ago. Somebody was asking me about organic yarns and kind of did I have an opinion on them. And this particular person had spent a lot of time visiting different knitting mills and buying samples and working with spinning them up and knitting them, and had determined that all of the best yarns were really organic. And what did I think about that? The problem that I have answering this question is that, well, for one thing, it doesn't matter really what I think is best if they have already determined what it is that they think is best, and that determination makes them happy about the choices that they're going to make in their knitting. I don't believe there is a best anything, because there's what is the best thing for me to use for this project, and what is the best thing for me to use is going to be based on whether I need to knit from my stash, if I can buy yarn, if I can buy any yarn I want, or if there are certain specifications, requirements that I need to keep in mind when I'm selecting the yarn, because there is no yarn that's going to be best in every situation. If I am going to knit a dishcloth, I'm going to use a cotton yarn that's machine washable and is rugged and it's not going to be super fine. I'm going to use a very specific yarn for that. If I'm making myself a wedding shawl and I want beautiful beads in it, and this is an heirloom piece, and I'm going to be selecting that yarn with a very different mindset. If I'm knitting something for a special baby, I'm going to take into account how easy it is to take care of based on the kind of garment it is. Like, how often will it have to be cleaned? Who is the person who's going to be cleaning it? And what kind of a pain is it going to be if it's hand wash only cashmere versus machine washable super wash wool or acrylic or some kind of blend? So the best yarn is completely dependent on the project, for one thing, Secondly, it depends on the person's budget who is purchasing that yarn, what they have just available to them in their area or what they can order and what they're comfortable doing. And the next thing is how that yarn is constructed, how it's prepared, how it's spun. Is it a plied yarn? Is it a multi-ply yarn? Is it a chainette yarn? Is it, there are so many different things to take into account. So this is the reason why I just really hesitate ever to say anything is best. I can say that if you are trying to knit stockinette fabric, the best stockinette fabric is going to have this appearance or these qualities. But that doesn't mean that the way you knit it necessarily matters. Like you can knit continental, you can knit English, you can knit Portuguese, you can knit whatever works for you in order to produce a fabric that has the results that are expected or that you want. That's the best way to knit. But there are no absolutes. I don't think that there's any point in doing that. Even when I have a definite preference in my own knitting for how I like to do things, I don't do it that way 100% of the time. Sometimes, these days, most of the time I'm knitting continental. But once in a while, I need to knit my old English style that I used for the first 20 some years I was a knitter, because of very certain set of circumstances where that is going to give me the best results. So, that's always my answer. There is no best. There is a best for you, or there is a best for this project, or there are certain things to take into or to keep in mind when you are making decisions about a particular project. I certainly have favorite types of yarns that I work with. That doesn't mean that they are the best yarns. It's like they meet the criteria for what it is I'm trying to do with my project and my stitch patterns. They serve the purpose of fulfilling those requirements for me. So I'm never going to say something is best. It's just not going to happen, whether it's yarn or tools or techniques or anything like that. Somebody asked me if I could at some point talk about knitting terms and crochet terms and how they differ from the US versus the UK. So I'll talk about a little bit here, just the ones I can think of off the top of my head. When I learned to knit, I was living in Ireland, and so the UK terms were used. So it was cast on, cast off, stocking stitch, things like that. So because I was an isolated knitter, my knitting needles I thought of in terms of metric terms. I didn't know the US needle sizes at all until I started the Master Hand Knitting program and actually had to pay attention to gauge. Like I knew that I would get the gauge listed in the pattern if I used that needle size, but I didn't pay any attention to what gauges I typically got with different needle sizes. So I started, paying attention, and I kind of memorized the US needle sizes versus the UK or metric needle sizes, just so I could learn them. And then I paid attention to, well, what gauge do I typically get when I use this needle size, and what yarns are typically used with this range of needle sizes. I just started paying attention instead of just doing what a pattern told me to do. And because I was isolated, so I had these metric needle sizes that's how I was thinking. A lot of my books were by British designers, and so I was just used to that terminology. And it wasn't until I started communicating with other knitters on Ravelry, and there were a lot more American knitters, and I was going to knitting groups and talking to other knitters, that I started changing and saying bind off instead of cast off. And I started saying stockinette instead of stocking stitch. And one of the things that I noticed was that there were this family of stitch patterns that had pretty much the same names in the UK as in the US, but they were offset by one. And here's what I mean by that. There is a stitch pattern in the US that we call seed stitch. And you get that by alternating between a knit one and a purl one all the way across the row. And then on the next row, or if you're working around the next round, if something looks like a knit stitch, you purl it. If it looks like a purl, you knit it. So you're going knit one, purl one all the way across the rows, and then up the columns, you're also knit one, purl one. So you're always alternating. So in the US, we call that seed stitch, but in the UK, they call that moss stitch. Well, we have a moss stitch as well. And the way you get moss stitch here in the US is, again, you alternate a knit one and a purl one, but as you're going up the columns, it's knit two, purl two. So you're working the stitches as they present on the second row around. So if it looks like a knit, you knit it. If it looks like a purl, you purl it. And it isn't until the third row that you shift to working it the opposite. And then the fourth row, again, however it's presenting, that's what you look like. So in the US, that's what we call moss stitch. But in the UK, they might call it double moss stitch, often Irish moss stitch. It's the kind of texture filler stitch that shows up a lot of times in Aran sweaters. Well, then we have a double moss stitch. Some people call it a double seed stitch. It has a couple of different names. And it's knit two, purl two all the way across, and then knit two, purl two up. So you have, you know, it's a 4-row repeat again, but it's also a 4-stitch repeat. In the UK, they call that box stitch. So we have a lot of the same names and we have the same stitch patterns, but the labels for them are a little bit off. So what that means is if you are working in a pattern and it's telling you to work in moss stitch for 4 inches, but it doesn't tell you how to work moss stitch, you need to kind of check and see if there are any hints in terms of the way things are spelled, like color. Is it spelled with an O-U-R at the end? Are they using metric terms? Are they, how are they presenting things? And so that you can know whether it's the UK moss stitch, which is our seed stitch, or if it's the US moss stitch, which is the UK Irish moss. So those are some things to kind of be aware of when it comes to stitch patterns. Most stitch patterns don't have a name, or if they have a name, it's not like set in stone. Like people say, what is the stitch pattern? I want to find other patterns, projects that use the stitch pattern. And like, it doesn't have a name. It might have a name in one pattern, but a different pattern could call it something else. So you might as well call it Fred or Sally, because it doesn't really matter. But stitch patterns like the seed moss stitch family are so ubiquitous. Everybody has it. And other languages are going to have other names for it as well. And if you needed to translate it, it might translate into something that didn't make sense. So that's just something to be aware of for that kind of a thing. Another thing to be aware of in British patterns, especially the older ones, is that they typically didn't use the term yarn over. Instead, they would either say yarn forward, like YF, or wool forward if it's an old pattern. So YF or YFWD for yarn forward or wool forward. They're expecting is that you are handling the yarn with your right hand. And so, because you were knitting English style, you bring the yarn to the front of the work, and then the next stitch that you work is a knit stitch. It's going to force you to bring the yarn over the top of the needle to the back in order to complete that stitch. So what they want is a yarn over. I mean, there are times when you are asked to bring the yarn forward and you're not creating a yarn over, you're slipping the stitch so that yarn goes in front of the stitch as you're working it. So those are things you have to be careful. Are they asking you to create a yarn over? Or are they asking you to just bring the yarn forward so that you are going to be slipping a stitch? So yarn forward is how British patterns talk about doing a yarn over between 2 knit stitches. But if you need to do a yarn over between 2 stitches that are not both knits, then they'll use a different abbreviation. So if you work a knit stitch and then you need to do a yarn over and then work a purl stitch, they're going to tell you yarn forward, yarn round needle. So YF and then YRN for yarn round needle, because you need to bring the yarn forward, over the needle, and around back to the front again in order to be prepared to do a purl stitch. If you are doing a purl stitch, then a yarn over, and then a knit stitch. The yarn is already in the front because you were just doing a purl stitch. So you just bring the yarn over needle, Y-O-N. And then you can do and then it's in the back and you can do your knit stitch. If you have 2 purl stitches and you need to do a yarn over, again, the yarn is already in the front. You need to bring, it's just yarn round needle, so YRN. So the yarn is going over the needle and then back to the front. So this can be very confusing for people. Why are they doing all of these things? Because they're telling you what to do to create a yarn over rather than telling you they want the result to be yarn over. If you are a continental knitter and you're holding the yarn in your left hand, the way that you do a yarn over is you're just catching that yarn with your right hand needle. There's no real difference in the movements that you have to make or repositioning the yarn. It's not like if you are an English knitter. But so those are things to look out for British knitting patterns. For crochet, the main thing to know is that, again, you have this sort of offset between US and UK terms. So in the US, there is a crochet term called slip stitch, and in the UK, that's single crochet. In the US, what we call single crochet, they call double crochet. So there's always this difference in how they describe those. And I was reading, I'm not a big crocheter, I was reading up on it a couple months ago, and there's some explanation in terms of the number of times that you're doing yarn overs when you're creating the stitch versus the number of times you're pulling yarn through or something. There's some sort of way to equate it, but that's something that you need to know if you're crocheting. Is this a British pattern or is this an American pattern? For vintage crochet patterns in the United States, there can be some ambiguity about which way they're presenting terms. I've seen differences in the same early 1900s from one yarn company to another in terms of the way that they are presenting the stitch patterns. So that's something to look out for too, is if you're using a vintage pattern to kind of pay attention and really look at what seems to be the most likely way that stitch should be worked. Okay, so then there's one other sort of category of things, and that is what we call items of clothing. So in the US, we call it a sweater. Whether it's a cardigan or a pullover, or if it's basically cardigan or pullover, it's a sweater. And in the UK, a jumper or a jersey might be a pullover, but if it opens up the front, it's a cardigan. That's very specific. If it's a sleeveless pullover that does not button up, I think it's a sleeveless pullover. We would just call that a vest. We would call it a vest even if it had buttons up the front. And the UK would call that a waistcoat. What the UK calls a vest is an undershirt. So tank top, there's another thing where there's a difference between what people call things. So when you are conversing or searching for patterns on Ravelry, you might have to learn the American terminology for certain things versus what you might be used to if you live in the UK. But on the other hand, if somebody is saying that they want to make a jumper, you should know and understand that they're saying that they want to knit a sweater, not that they want to knit a dress like the one I'm wearing, only that you would wear like a turtleneck shirt underneath. Like that's what in the US we would call a jumper, is a type of dress, which I think in the UK they call like a pinafore, or I don't know, they have some other name for it. But it's one of these things where we have all of the same words, we're just not applying them in the same way. So sometimes you just have to learn, and don't be irritated and don't think, oh, well, they should be calling it by this name. That's the correct name. Why are they using so confused? It's just learning to communicate. When I first went to the UK, I had to learn that when I went to a shop, I had to ask for, I was interested in buying a pair of tights, even though what I really wanted was what I would call pantyhose. The kind of clothing item that I would call tights would have had a much thicker, opaque material, and would have been something I wore when I was 6 years old, not something that I was wearing to an office environment when I was in my early 20s. So, and then I had to learn that when I snagged them and they ripped, that was not a run. I was used to getting a run in my pantyhose, but it was a ladder in my tights. So I had to learn all of these different expressions so that I could communicate with people and they would understand what I was saying. And then when I moved to New Zealand, I thought I had it all down. I went to a shop and they said I would like to buy a pair of tights, and they wanted to sell me the thing that I think of as tights, like the really thick, opaque type of garment. And it turned out they call it pantyhose there. But you don't get a run in your pantyhose in New Zealand, you would get a ladder in your pantyhose. So it was just, there was always like another shift that I had to make. And so by the time I came back to the United States, I was juggling different terms for different things, and I just had to listen to what people were saying. In Minnesota, they have words for things that we didn't use in Michigan. So I had to learn what those terms were, and it's just learning to communicate. So those are some knitting and crochet things to be aware of when you are encountering a pattern, either from a different time period or just from a different location. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. I hope you'll join me this Sunday, June 21st, for my Short Rows live stream right here on this channel. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.